What was the beginning of the Reagan Revolution like? Good evening, everyone. I'm Linda Laurel. Welcome to Red, White, and Blue. A new book addresses that question. It's called When Things Went Right, The Dawn of the Reagan-Bush Administration. In the book, author Chase Untermeyer captures the era of President Reagan and Vice President Bush and their approach to domestic, political, and foreign policy. Untermeyer draws upon his personal journal and point of view as a Washington insider to take us on a journey through the White House during this conservative era. Untermeyer was executive assistant to then Vice President Bush. Tonight, we are very pleased to welcome the author himself, Chase Untermeyer. And as always, leading our discussion, our hosts, David Jones and Gary Polland.
Now, David, after reading this book, don't you tell me you weren't nostalgic for when things went right, when Reagan and Bush were running the country.
And
Untermeyer, don't forget him.
I look forward to the type of midterm results that I saw in the book. Yes. 1982, I remember it as a very good year.
It was certainly the last good Democratic year in Texas.
That's true. That's true. Anyway, I enjoyed it so much. In fact, I'm going to continue reading even past this show. All right.
A true compliment. Thank
and
you.
I think actually that it's Gary's first book of the year, so you should be thrilled that you tempted him.
I read more books than that, David. But I want one of the things I want to ask you first, Chase, is this. Did you find when you reviewed your notes, because you told me you've been a diarist since you've been age 9, when you reviewed your notes to write this book, did you find anything that was surprising to you when you read it, looking backwards? Because this is, a number of years ago, 34 years ago.
I've found that I had forgotten about 90% of what I found in those pages. I thought I had a pretty good memory for especially a very exciting time in my life. But as it turned out, the volume of things that I captured day to day, the volume of things we did in the White House and around the world was such that it was almost like reading somebody else's book. And yet I had a special interest in the person writing it.
Very interesting. And the other thing that we've talked about that in your book that came out is that the amount of time it took in your job, and you were a key aide to Vice President Bush, but you told us everyone that worked around the vice president in the level that you were in key positions were not married, because you really didn't, you were married to your job pretty much. You were always traveling, always busy.
That's one thing that people often forget. They think of Washington life as punching the clock in at 9, out at 5. That's never the case in the White House. The White House is a constantly throbbing organization, particularly in the start of an administration. Doesn't matter which party, it just consumes vast parts of a day. And in the case of the life that we led, because the then Vice President was constantly on the road, traveling to Republican fundraising events or to foreign affairs of one kind or another, that meant constant travel. In 2 years, I made 99 trips, and 10 of those were overseas trips, and many of those trips were multi-week trips.
So it sounds like you're past the million-mile club.
Well, I only got to about 350,000 as of the end of that second year.
So divide up, if you will, the trips that were Vice President needs to be at some there was a funeral. Brezhnev, as I remember, was one of your trips. Official trips versus, and this is my distinction, not a legal distinction, versus political trips because of the big 1982 midterm election. If you could, maybe size up what the difference or the numbers were there, percentage-wise.
Pretty much every domestic trip had some kind of political additive to it, such as a fundraiser, if not an appearance for a candidate. And that's largely, frankly, so that the Republican National Committee would pay for the trip, or the candidate himself or herself, as opposed to the taxpayers. So that often was the case. I remember one trip, which was pure pleasure, to the Super Bowl, which was held that year in Detroit, had a Republican fundraiser added on to it so that the RNC would pay for the trip to the Super Bowl and nobody would allege we did that at taxpayer expense.
Gosh, that has been going on that long, that practice.
And it hasn't changed. I mean, it's still under the President administration, and Vice President Biden does the same thing.
So I'm going to name 5 people, too, that I wrote about in the book. For, impressive people, who most impressed you of the following 5? The Chancellor of Germany, Schmidt. Another Chancellor of Germany, Helmut Kohl, Francois Mitterrand, Prince Charles, I would call him a foreign leader of sort, and then Menachem Begin.
Aha. You're asking me to pick which of those?
Yeah,
or?
which one really stands out in your mind?
Well, I'll have to eliminate Begin because he's mentioned in the book, but not met. So I can't claim him.
Now, he wasn't very well liked, though, was he? But in the Bush wing of our political life.
I think it's safe to say that he wasn't particularly liked in the Reagan administration as such, and that's only because Menachem Begin, by his very personality, was a very querulous gut fighter. That was how he came to power in Israel. And that it was just thought that he was not the nice guy that we wanted to interact with on these matters. And of course, that didn't matter a bit to Begin. He was in it in order to be tough and bash the Palestinians when he could. So,
and that got us into Lebanon, didn't it? That conflict.
Well, there was the feeling at the time that the United States had to insert itself into Lebanon in order to get the Israelis out, and also simultaneously to get Yasser Arafat out. But unfortunately, that still left a lot of other bad actors and players in Lebanon that, as we know, came to tragic
lo and
turn.
behold, things haven't changed.
No, it's just a
So we're
nasty
down to four
neighborhood.
then. We're down to four.
Well, of the ones you mentioned, Francois Mitterrand was a man I can't claim to have spent much time with, but he was a deep, deep intellectual in the way only France seems to elect people. And as such, was the sort of person who would have weighty, in-depth conversations with regard to foreign affairs, the meaning of the state and the meaning of the interstatal system, things like that would fascinate him. It would not be the sort of thing to fascinate George Bush, who was much more of a practical politician. Nevertheless, they got along quite well, and that is surprising because, of course, Mitterrand was the first socialist president elected in France, and when he was elected, he put communists into his cabinet, which horrified the Reagan administration. Mitterrand said, as an example of this kind of deft, classic French political thought, that this was the greatest blow he would ever administer to the Communist Party of France, because by putting these ministers in actual portfolios where they had to do some work and produce, he knew they would collapse, fall on their face, and that would be the, ultimate embarrassment to the French Communist Party and lead the left into his party, the Socialist Party. And he told this to the Reagan administration and to Vice President Bush when he made an early visit to Paris, and it proved to be correct. And after that point, Mitterrand was one of the staunchest friends of the United States during that period.
Interesting. One of the characters that you wrote about in the book, I call him a character, is Secretary of State Haig, because
yes.
it looked like Haig was really concerned about his territory. It sounded like he was as territorial as your dog at home in terms of intervention. And President or Vice President Bush, then Vice President Bush, was the crisis manager for the administration, and Haig had a problem with that. So tell us a little bit how he operated and your take on him.
Yes, well, Alexander Haig was a sad case in many ways. He was an outstanding military officer. He did great service to the United States at a very crucial moment as Chief of Staff to Richard Nixon at the very, very end of that administration. And I think he was a great patriot. At the same time, he had an immense, in fact, that is being modest, ego. He saw himself as truly one of the great minds and leaders of the country, unappreciated, no doubt, by the lesser beings with whom he was thrown together in the Reagan administration. He clearly saw himself, when he was selected as Secretary of State, as he put it, the vicar of foreign policy. He was going to lead this lovely but dim-witted man from California through the thickets of foreign affairs. And when other people expressed interest in these matters that he thought of as his own domain, such as the Vice President, who had something of a foreign policy background himself, he took it as an immense insult. And when, as it turned out in the middle of March of 1981, just a few weeks after the inauguration, President Reagan did something very logical, which was to say that if I, Ronald Reagan, cannot preside over a meeting of the National Security Council during a crisis of some sort, the Vice President will. The Vice President is a statutory member of the National Security Council and is the Vice President. So this did not seem a particularly radical selection, but it struck Alexander Haig as an absolute javelin in the heart. And he, at one point, when he was notified of this, even said that, "I think I'll resign." This was to him
Well,
such
but he got his revenge in a sense when the Libyan aircraft were shot down by our aircraft. Both Bush and Reagan were out of town, and Mr. Haig announced that this crisis has been handled.
Yes, he had his moments, but only his moments. And he was always the odd man out in the administration when, on the day that President Reagan was shot, which only followed this crisis manager flap by about a week, on that particular day, he made his ill-chosen statement that, as for now, I am in control in the White House. And that just underscored everybody's presumption of him as a power grabber who was out for himself.
And where were you when Reagan was shot?
I was with Vice President Bush on board Air Force Two. The plane was literally gathering speed to take off from Fort Worth when, where Bush had spoken to the Texas Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association. And when that plane was taking off, the Secret Service lead agent got word on his earpiece that there had been an attempt on President Reagan. And that's all he knew, just what that word was. And the agent walked forward the plane, which is a little bit challenging when the plane is lifting off. But anyway, he passed the word to us on the way to the private cabin where the vice president was.
And there was some, I'm sorry, but there was one little aspect of this that I caught that I'd like for you to tell me whether I'm right or wrong or not, which had to do with Bush's sensitivity to when he arrived in Washington and where he went first and the like, and the sensitivity that he had to Mrs. Reagan.
Yes, on that particular day, we were in Texas. The plane went from Fort Worth to Austin, where Bush was supposed to speak to the joint session of the Texas legislature. That was canceled. Plane was refueled in Austin. Then Governor Mrs. Clements and George Strait, Jr. of Houston, the State Secretary of State, came on board for a few minutes during that time. And then they got off so the plane could take off to return to Washington. It was right at that point, and I happened to overhear this particular discussion, that the lead Secret Service agent and the vice president's military aide made the case that when he returned to Washington, that instead of taking a helicopter from Andrews Air Force Base to the Naval Observatory, which is where the vice president lives, that they should go to the south lawn of the White House. That was a secure spot. And that, of course, was the sort of thing the Secret Service cared about, because at that point no one knew if there was some kind of elaborate conspiracy where there'd be an attack on others. But Bush said quite correctly that that was not his preference, that unless they could give him a compelling security reason not to go to the Naval Observatory, that's what he'd do, because, he said, the South Lawn is only where the president lands. And also, Mrs. Reagan was highly distraught, of course, and she would have been in her bedroom just outside or just inside from the heavy, heavy noise generated by a helicopter landing. And that he recognized immediately was both symbolically and personally the wrong choice.
When you found out that President Reagan had been shot, what went through your mind?
Well, first of all, when we got the word, it was very fragmentary. And what the report was there's been an attempt on the president, and 2 agents are down. As we know, there was 1 Secret Service agent and 1 Washington policeman who were also shot, as well as Jim Brady. We didn't know about his being shot at the time. So there was great questioning what was going on. And here we were in a, if you will, flying command center, and yet trying to get news of what was happening back in Washington was extremely difficult. There was a television in the cabin, but to make matters absolutely frustrating, every time the pilots had a transmission to the ground, which they did frequently because it was such a short flight from Fort Worth to Austin, that blotted out our TV coverage. So it was just to the point we might learn something that everything went fuzzy. It wasn't until later that we got more information.
So I guess part of that is it tells you how much communications has changed in the last 34 years. I mean, really significant, where we know a lot more. Okay, I want to ask you about your take on President Reagan. You obviously were a Bush confidant. You were involved in the Bush campaign for president in 1980. You didn't get to know President Reagan, I guess, till you got to the White House. Fair?
Yes, and I don't want to overstate how I got to know him. I was around because the West Wing is a rather small place, about the size, I might add, of a suburban house. The West Wing has 2 or 3 floors, but the main floor where the Oval Office is, and the Vice President's office, the Chief of Staff, the Cabinet Room, is really not much bigger than the House. And for that reason, it was truly a matter of looking around the corner so as not to run into the President of the United States as he was making that corner. So I did have several close encounters, not, I'm glad to say, belly encounters, but the fact is that I did have the pleasure of seeing him close in. When he died in 2004, various local television stations called me because they wanted to localize the story. And they kept saying, well, tell us some stories about President Reagan, about how you saw him. And I had to tell them that I did have these kind of encounters of being in meetings and seeing him sign bills and all that sort of thing. And this was very disappointing to these reporters. They wanted to have some kind of story. And the point I made was that those kind of moments, which others had and I didn't, really were not important. What was important for us and what was important for him as the leader of the country were the Reagan moments we all saw. That is, when he spoke to the country, when he appeared on stage, when he was exercising his great gifts as a communicator. I'm glad to say I had many of those moments too, not as intimate as I think these reporters wanted me to tell, but I do contend that those moments of Reagan were much more significant than any private moments.
Well, it was the wit, though, and I don't know whether the wit was always expressed in a calculated manner or whether it came out spontaneously. Maybe you can shed some light on that, because there was the joke that he told after the Libyan aircraft event, because he had been asleep in California somewhere, and he said that, you know, when he was asked about, you know, what you were sleeping through this thing, he said, well, I've given instructions to, you know, wake me the next time, even if it's a cabinet meeting. So,
yes, and that was one of his great strengths, was to use humor supposedly against himself, but really it was always a jab at the opposition or the critics, because it made them seem kind of pointless and silly.
was that natural to him?
Very natural, and I have to say that we miss that in our modern politics. There is something about modern Republican conservative politics which is so concerned about debt deficit, abortion, gun rights, whatever it is, that people just never smile. They are so dead serious. They, not to say that their concern isn't well placed, but the fact is that they fail to grasp the brilliant weapon that Ronald Reagan had in humor. And it's kind of in short supply on the Democratic side, too. So I think if anybody would have the humor of a Bob Dole or an Alan Simpson or a Ronald Reagan today on the Republican side, they would sweep hearts. But no, what we see are very grim faces and one candidate trying to seem more concerned than the next.
Right. The Reagan-Bush relationship. Obviously, I wouldn't call them bitter rivals, but it was a strong rivalry in the primary, and then the race was really pretty close till Reagan broke through at the end. And so, how did you observe that relationship evolve from competitors to compadres?
Yes, Ronald Reagan and George Bush had known each other in political circles going back, I suppose, 10 or more years before 1980 came along to throw them together as rivals. And you're quite right that this was a team that was put together for the convenience of the Republican Party. There was no evident fondness there, and according to testimony of others who were around Reagan, that he was very reluctant to take Bush on because he didn't think that Bush was truly a supporter of the Republican platform that he had helped craft and put through. But they had to do it, and it turned out to be a great successful political move. What they then discovered is that they really, too, liked each other. And no surprise, because Ronald Reagan and George Bush were such eminently likable and people-loving people, to the point that it would seem natural that they would come to enjoy each other. But very significantly was something once that Barbara Bush said to me, that she was surprised, she said, to learn that Ronald and Nancy Reagan were not like the Reagan people. And what she meant was the kind of people.
He's talking about you, Gary.
Yeah, right,
well,
okay.
People Gary and I have known in those
so that was
days.
for Bush in 80.
But these were people who were not particularly pleasant, who were vengeful and suspicious and
Humorless.
humorless, all those kind of qualities, and they kind of assumed that Ronald and Nancy Reagan were like that. Now, it was a mistake, of course, but it was a very telling mistake.
And then they ended up with a very close relationship.
Yes.
How did Bush handle this? He had referred to supply-side economics during the primary as voodoo economics. And suddenly there was this major recession in 1981, 82, 10% unemployment. You all had passed this major tax bill, which David Stockman identified as, nothing but pork for, people who were throwing, tax cuts everywhere. Everything crashed and burned. It didn't. Well, the economy was in bad
the
shape,
economy
and the
exploded after that.
Republicans lost 27 House seats. Bush, it seems, was correct about voodoo economics, and yet he tried to reconcile in his own mind and on the hustings what he meant and how maybe his views had changed.
Well, it won't surprise you to know that I disagree with your economic interpretation.
Yeah,
Let's not forget that we came out of the Carter years when we had double-digit inflation and interest rates off the charts, widespread unemployment. And one of the first things that was done, this was not by Ronald Reagan and George Bush, but by Jimmy Carter's own Fed chairman, Paul Volcker, was to jack up interest rates some more to wring inflation out of the economy. And once that was done and the tax cuts were in place and a deregulatory regime began, which was the other part of the Reagan economic program, then the situation was in place to have happened what did happen, which is pretty soon after that shellacking of the 1982 election when the economy began to rebound.
Yes, remember it was morning in America.
No, I wasn't
1984.
speaking as an economist. I was saying that politically it looked as if there was a loss of the sort of the Reaganomics took a blow, and I in that election.
Well, and the key thing to remember is that the slogan of the Republican Party at that time was to stay on course, not to give up the program just because it looked like it was not working or it was politically uncomfortable at the time.
And of course, it had just passed, so you need to have a little time for the impact to have on the reforms that Reagan and Bush did, David. And remember, we had a booming economy in the 80s. And we won in 1984, and we won in 86.
It was a pretty tough year. It was a pretty tough year in 1982, and you went a lot of places in order to support the Republican ticket, and so did George Bush. There was one Republican that he didn't especially want to go do anything for, which was the governor of Texas, Mr. Clements. and you tell this great story about Mickey Leadon, our congressman, who came to see you, and Mark White had just been elected governor, and you mentioned how you and Mickey both had something in common, is that neither one of you got along with the governors of your state.
I think the phrase I used was that he now had to do what I had to do, which was to pretend I liked the governor of Texas.
That's right.
I don't know his problem with Mark White, who is one of the more delightful people, unlike Bill Clements, whom I had known in politics. So I can't tell you why Mickey had problems with Mark.
Interesting. Okay, favorite. David gave you a list of leaders. How about the favorite foreign leader you met that you thought were the most interesting and engaging? Well,
no question, it had to be Margaret Thatcher, just someone who I had come to admire from just reading about her. And then very early in the administration, George Bush made a trip to Paris, and where he met with Mitterrand, and then went across the channel for meetings with Margaret Thatcher. She gave dinner at number 10 Downing Street, and I was very honored to be on the guest list. I may have been at the very bottom of the American guests, but I was there. And anybody who loves history has a mental picture of the door at number 10 Downing Street with the numerals 10 in white on a black door, and how much of a thrill it was not only to see that door, but to actually go through it and to be inside number 10 Downing Street. And after the usual photo op, we all went upstairs to have dinner, which was magnificent in that historic space. And the dinner aside, afterwards was even more thrilling from a historian's point of view, and that is that I made a crass tourist request, and that was, could we go look at the cabinet room of number 10 Downing Street, where so much world history had taken place. And I couldn't have asked a better question. Margaret Thatcher was only too delighted to show her American guests the cabinet room, and we went there. And that closed off a very memorable occasion. But she dominated the scene, not architecture.
One last Brett that you were close to and had some interaction with was Prince Charles. And the only thing I want to ask you about that is whether or not you agreed with George Herbert Walker Bush that this sort of off-ball sense or weird sense of humor that the Prince demonstrated was like his son George. Do you remember that?
I do remember that, and I quoted him as saying it. He knew George W.'s humor a lot better than I did at that time, at least. But I think what it meant is that both young men did have a sort of quirkiness that came from being raised in a very special environment and exercising their quirkiness by letting their opinion be known from time to time.
Well,
and
Chase,
the Prince still does that.
Yes, right.
Time's up, Chase.
Yeah, we
Thank you so
enjoyed it.
much. We actually could talk hours because this is a wonderful book.
2 volumes to go.
When things were right, Linda, you know, I mean.
I want to know if he's still
Reagan-Bush.
keeping the diary. Are you still keeping a diary every day?
I am indeed, yes. Today will be
Discipline.
recorded.
My goodness, what discipline. Well, remember, you can catch Red, White, and Blue every Friday at 7:30 p.m. right here on TV8 and again Saturdays at 6:30 p.m. We also invite you to visit us online and send us your comments. We want to hear what you are saying about the issues that affect Houston. You can submit your comments at houstonpublicmedia.org or on Facebook. And while you're there, don't forget to like us. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you again next week. Good night.